This week we are going to talk about The Fortunate Pilgrim, which is the second novel by Mario Puzo, came out in 1965, and it's directly preceding The Godfather. And then on Thursday we'll continue with our discussion of The Godfather film, part 1, before advancing to part 2. So Mario Puzo really thought that this novel would establish him as one of the great American novelists, right? You know about this particular dream, typical of the 20th century. If you want to have a career, you want to, in the US, you dream of writing one of the great American novels, when the novel was still an instrument, not just an intellectual product, but the novel was believed to be an instrument of change, right? Something to have a social impact with. And certainly the themes of the novel, in a way, supported that kind of claim. Puzo had been working during the post-war era in different capacities as a writer, as an editor, as a writer of short stories, as an editor, but I would call it a story doctor, someone getting an average text and improving it, making this text more readable, easier to sell. But finally he thought that he graduated with The Fortunate Pilgrim. And in fact, he did receive positive reviews. I can tell you that personally, I don't like the way the story is developed in this book, but the prose in this book, especially in the first half of the book, is far better than the prose you find often in The Godfather. So, positive reviews, but not raving reviews, because by 1965, the great American novel was not about an Italian-American mother who becomes a widow and has to take care of 6 kids and tries to follow them and help them reach their goals in life, living the American dream for migrants. The intellectual novels had moved to other kinds of content. In a way, The Fortunate Pilgrim was 50 years late in terms of characters, setting. The feel of the novel was not modern enough. The psychology of the characters was not developed in a modern way. In terms of the characters and their psychological depth, the situations they have to face, the emotional world of the characters, the novel is more similar to 19th century novels about lower class characters and their struggles in society. And clearly, even into the 20th century, American writers followed that kind of novel. But by the 1930s, that model was declining in popularity. Faced with the disappointing results of The Fortunate Pilgrim, Puzo started writing The Godfather, and he wrote The Godfather for the next 3, almost 4 years, and finally was published in 1969. Because really, Puzo himself was so disappointed that he thought that he should write a novel with the specific primary goal of selling books, becoming rich, being able at least to support his family. And hence the label of pot boiler used often to qualify The Godfather. For example, even Ford Coppola, the director of the film, called The Godfather a pot boiler, right? Something you write with the idea of putting something in the pot on the stove to make ends meet. We should not exaggerate the situation. Was not that dramatic. Puzo secured an advance, even though not a big amount, for the Godfather. Already had some interest when he wrote the first 10-page treatment of the novel. He immediately received interest from publishers. So it's not like he was a complete unknown coming out with this big global success, selling millions of copies. Then, after The Godfather sold millions of copies everywhere and the movie came out, The Fortunate Pilgrim was republished, and already during the 20th century, the last 25 years, sold about 2 million copies, right? But he himself knew that people were buying the book looking for something else, right? Not based on the strengths of the novel itself. The reason why we're looking at it, and I included 2 chapters from part 1 of the book, just to give you a sense of what the novel is about. But the reason why we're interested in this is, as we saw with the introduction, the premise to the 50th edition of The Godfather, that Puzo himself numerous times claimed that Don Vito Corleone is based on his mother's voice and values, qualities. So let's go and look at this, see what truth there is in that kind of statement. Okay, so I'll tell you a few things about the story, the plot, the characters, the themes, and the style, and then my plan would be to do a short activity on the novel itself. So what you see on the screen is taken from the page that I posted this morning, week 8 page, the first section about this novel. So the novel starts in 1928 and takes place in Hell's Kitchen. I don't know if you're familiar with this definition. If you're not a Manhattanite, Hell's Kitchen starts around 34th Street, which these days would be north of Hudson Yards, which has become a very posh area, but it used to be, until recently, a railroad hub of some importance. And don't forget that from 34th Street down to the tip of Manhattan, you would have the docks and ships coming in with different kinds of supplies. So it was a significant commercial hub. And Hell's Kitchen went all the way to 59th Street, which would be at the same level of the southern bottom boundary of Central Park. Okay? It was called Hell's Kitchen for reasons that are not completely clear. You can find, I linked the name Hell's Kitchen to a Wikipedia article, which brings you back to a statement by David Crockett, for example. And basically we know that by the end of the 19th century, that was a common phrase to call that area, which was a poor area for mostly Irish and Italian migrants living in tenements. The tenement is kind of a low-level condominium, right, with small apartments, often without a bathroom, either with shared bathrooms or bathrooms outside in a courtyard, with multiple families sometimes residing in the same apartment. Garbage collection was minimal to non-existent. Hygienic conditions were often subpar. Okay. And a lot of the people living in these tenements were working for low wages. However, you have to keep in mind the situation they left behind, either in southern Italy or in Ireland, a situation of poverty. And in this case, there is a reference at different points in the novel to the fact that the protagonist, Lucia Santa, the mother, left Italy because she belonged to a peasant family so poor that they couldn't afford enough the money to buy what in Italian would be the corredo. The corredo is the bride's linen, right? Italian families traditionally, even my family, I had a sister, did that for my sister, would, from the time a woman was a child, put away towels, bed sheets, tablecloths, other items, so that when it was time for this female member of the family to get married and move into the new house, she would have the basic equipment, right, for the new family. Okay, so the protagonist, like other women from the earliest part of the 20th century, is part of a combined marriage, right? She is married by proxy in the local township, in the local town hall, right? Before she embarks in this voyage across the ocean, both for moral and for legal reasons, right? Legal reasons as someone married to an American citizen, a naturalized immigrant, or an immigrant with a visa, she can enter the United States, and morally, because a single woman is not supposed to travel unescorted by herself as a single woman, exposed to all kinds of threats. As a married woman, her condition is seen as more honorable, more reputable. She's protected by her status in a way. Don't forget, before I move on to the other details, that the novel is autobiographical. Puzo himself was born in 1920, right? So 1928, he would have been a kid age 8. And another important element that overlaps Puzo's life and the book is that in 1932, his father was taken to a mental hospital, the Pilgrim Hospital on Long Island, which is actually mentioned in the book itself. Okay, and Frank, Lucia Santa's husband, suffers from some kind of mental illness and is taken first to Bellevue and then to this Pilgrim Hospital in Brentwood. It was, right? There were several mental institutions in Long Island, and then they created the big compound that is near Nissequogue. I don't know if you've ever been there. So 1928 means in the middle almost of the Prohibition era, which lasted 13 years, but by 1928 bootlegging was prevalent all over the United States, especially in big cities. We've seen Chicago, right? Bootlegging is there in the story of Scarface, the original Scarface. New York City was no exception. And it's the year before the stock market crash of 1929, which prompted the Depression, the Great Depression, that lasted practically until the beginning of the war. The New Deal helped somewhat, but contrary to popular beliefs, did not really improve the economy overall for the first few years, right? It took quite a while, and then the war helped a lot with the military efforts. There is no denying that, even though that created a mindset whereby it was seen as positive to have wars, and the assumption was that a war is ground for profit for the industries in the military complex and everyone else involved as well. Of course, the characters themselves in the second half of the book will suffer the consequences of the Great Depression. There is a baker that loses $5,000 or $10,000, I believe, because money in the bank, when the bank crashed, could not be retrieved, or people got $1 per $100 that they deposited. The protagonist finds herself affected by this less than other characters because Lucia Santa has placed her money in postal savings. Okay, her own savings plus Lucia comes. The premise, because this is just the past of the character at the beginning of the novel. Lucia, and in 1928, is about 37, which is old by the times standard. I have to say that because, of course, you have a skewed view of ages. So 37 would be, what is today, 55? I don't know, something like that, probably. She, in 1928, has this background. Age 17, she came to the United States, married by proxy to a man she didn't know, Antonio. Not a love story, and love doesn't blossom after her arrival. They have 3 children. He works for the railroads, and that's why they lived in Hell's Kitchen. But then he died in an accident. She's a widow with 2 kids, one pregnant with the third one, actually, Vinny. And she finds another man who's not married, age 35, who proposes to her. They have 3 more children together, and the 6 of them live on the top floor of this tenement. They consider themselves lucky to have these few rooms in this E-shaped apartment, shaped like an E without the central prong, with limited privacy. 2 of the boys, for example, sleep in the living room, etc. Okay, so this is the premise for the story. The place is important because really the characters, especially in the first part of the novel, live within a very small geographical context. The apartment itself, a lot of scenes take place there, and then the place outside the building, the stoop where they go initially at the beginning of the story. It's summer, June, July, I think, the beginning of summer. So they spend time at night, no AC there, right, on the stoop, or just sitting with chairs in the sidewalk talking to their neighbors. And the block itself is the limit for the meanderings of the kids, for example. Okay, so it's a very limited world, and in a way socially claustrophobic, right? A bit oppressive, right? It's the contrary of this idea of America, land of freedom. The complete opposite. Whether by self-inhibition or by social pressures, the characters limit their dealings to a very small place. When references are introduced to the world that to the characters themselves is the outside, there is always something negative about it. So there are nearby shops, of course, and there are references especially to the bakery where 2 of the kids will end up working. There are fruit stands, ice cream and lemon ice stands. There is a place nearby where you can go and drink bootlegged wine and presumably other alcoholic beverages in the house of an Italian-American woman. Nearby, as I mentioned, at the south of Hell's Kitchen, there is Hudson Yards, right, where now you find posh apartments, expensive restaurants, shops selling you $100,000 watches. There you have the very active railroad yards, and from there you actually have big, long trains being moved through the city. Okay, so it's a different kind of New York City. Imagine a full train, a commercial train, a train with supplies, not passengers, being moved through the western side of Manhattan until they can enter the network, railroad network, right? And what does railroad yards represent to the characters? Of course, it's a source of jobs. Several of the characters work for a time, at least for some time there, find employment there. For example, at the beginning you find Larry, Lorenzo, working on a horse, being sent to warn people of a coming train, right? Because you have this big train coming through the streets of New York, and you have someone on a horse telling people there is a train, be careful, move away. So with the horse is able to go back and forth, it's like a dog, like a shepherd dog, moving around the train. It's also the source of resources for the family. So the kids go there to steal small amount of coal from the yard, or the train themselves, the cars of the trains, or ice, right? People don't have fridges, but people need ice for their ice box or to place in a piece of furniture sealed where they can keep their meats and other food so that they don't get spoiled. And the yard is also where you come in contact with the enforcing agents in society, right? You have a cop called the Bull who engages in several confrontations with the kids or other grown-up sons in the family. Of course, nearby you have Irish tenements, blocks where you find just Irish people, and there is tension. There is social tensions between the Irish and Italians, especially among kids and younger inhabitants. The outside world is also the schools, which are mentioned in the conversations, right? It's summer, so the kids are home, and eventually they'll go back to school, but school is negative in that the family, and especially this woman who's the leader of the family, Lucia Santa, has no control over the schools, right? What kids are taught, how they behave there, etc. Outside, there is also a more Anglo community that comes intruding into their world, right? Tenements were often visited by all kinds of missionaries or members of different churches. In this case, we have Frank, the second husband of Lucia, who is approached by a couple trying to convert him to a Protestant church. And he's more than willing to do that, first of all, because he's receiving attention from them. And a lot of these characters suffers from social isolation, solitude. And also because the husband in this couple of Baptist believers, the husband is offering him work in a chocolate factory. But that job will be short-lived because after a short stint, Frank will go completely insane. Well, his mental illness will manifest itself. It's not like the chocolate factory is making him go mad. Octavia is one of Lucia's daughters from her first marriage. So at the beginning of the novel, she's about 16, and she works outside the house, outside the neighborhood. So that's also the outside world. Again, the issue, the concern there from the main character, the mother, is that, again, she has little control over Octavia's world when she goes out to work, first as a dressmaker, then because she's very ambitious, she takes a job to sell sewing machines, which involves training people, instructing people how to use a sewing machine, which was very common as a sales tactic. This was very common during the time, right? In order to sell something, you offer free services. For example, how do you sell vacuum cleaners? during the first part of the 20th century. Any idea? Have you heard? Have you seen films? Chris?
It's like an in-house now.
Pardon me?
They like bring it to your house and demo it.
Yeah, essentially cleaning a whole room for the woman you're about to sell this machine, right? You create this sense of debt. I'm indebted to you because you performed this service and you went out of your way, but it's just a tactic. You went out of your way to clean thoroughly an entire section of the house, and even though this represents a value, let's say, of $2 for the time, I'm buying from you a $25 piece of machine, piece of appliance, right? So in this case, she she teaches women how to use the sewing machine and then sells them a cheap sewing machine. Her dream would be to become a teacher. She would like, even though she abandoned school, she would like to go to night school. Her mother doesn't allow it because, again, going to night school represents going into the outside world, right? Being exposed to all kinds of influences outside of the family. Then there are constant references to the suburbs in both directions. Going west, New Jersey, where people have houses, even Italian Americans are richer, or Long Island, and by the end of the novel, Lucia allegedly fulfills her dream by moving to Long Island. The end of the book is the family putting everything on a track, and Lucia and some of members of his family are about to move to Long Island finally at the end, in the mid-1940s, at the beginning of the war. They're able to purchase a house from people who have to sell the house because there is still a crisis. And then there is a reference around New York City. There are plenty of rural areas, right? Even on Long Island there are farms. And it's interesting that farms are seen in a positive fashion by the characters. It's a place where you work in a healthier environment compared to the factory, the railroad track, which is of course very dangerous, right? There is no denying those jobs were dangerous. And also the idea that there is less stress when you work in a natural environment, whereas the city is this noisy, smelly, unsanitary place. Outside world, in terms of negative places, the hospitals, because Bellevue and then the Pilgrim Hospital are places for poor people. This one is called at some point a charity hospital, so it does something to your own dignity. As in The Godfather, we find a plurality of characters. Puzo was more comfortable with working with a lot of characters. In this case, you find Lucia Santa, the mother and the matriarch of the family, the three kids from her first marriage, who are Gino, Larry, and Octavia, and the three kids from her second marriage, who are Eileen, called Lena, Vinny, and there is another one whose name escapes me, right? Still, even though you have a plurality of characters followed through the book, they all relate to the central character of the mother, trying to keep the family together. So the mother is not the protagonist because the story is about her or because she's in every page. But even when the focus is on some other character, their concerns are often connected, related to the matriarch Lucia. What is the education they received? Because these characters are growing up, right? They're different ages, from a toddler or an infant, rather, at the beginning of the film, of the book, to characters who are teenagers, and then they grow up. Like, as I said, the temporal arc of the novel is about 13, 14 years. It's not clear exactly when it ends, but about 41, 42, from 28 to 42. So how's their development? So education in a broader worldly meaning. First of all, family practices, right? They grow up in an environment, they observe the adults. They see how the adults interact with their siblings, and they learn from that because they want to please their parents and avoid punishment or reproach, right? This is it's not a functional family. It's very much a dysfunctional family. And that's how children, even now, grow in a dysfunctional family. They limit themselves, they regulate themselves to keep the equilibrium in the family, not to upset the parents, right? I don't know if you've read or seen videos on YouTube about childhood trauma, okay? They also get their mentality shaped by the stories, especially the stories told by the women, not just Lucia, the mother, but also her female neighbors. There is another widow in particular, Luch, but there are other women, and the women talk. They tell stories from the past, they're like parables, or they tell stories from their neighbors, so essentially gossip, right? Hear what this woman did. For example, one of those stories would be a couple got married, and the bride, the daughter in this marriage, refused to interrupt her honeymoon to come back and visit her mother who got sick. So what kind of a woman would do that? What disrespect, right? So it's gossip and judgment, and therefore every story has a moral, and the kids who are listening absorb this kind of value set. And belonging to the family is the primary channel to define your identity, and even when you're outside in the world, you're still the daughter or the son of, you represent the family in the world. But in a way that is dysfunctional, meaning that you're exposed to the potential criticism of the world, of society, which would reverberate and get to your family. So whatever you do has repercussions, but your family will not protect you. I don't know if you've been involved or seen this kind of dynamics. You find it to this day. Possibly more common among low-income families. So your family is being judged through what you do or say in the world. And therefore your family will criticize you or will control you instead of supporting you and defending you from the attacks of the world, right? It's not a unit that will come together to protect one of their own from criticism that is extreme, not fully justified. No. They would take the side of the world. They would, if any member of the family is attacked, they would say, why did you put yourself in that situation? Now we are going to have to pay for it, instead of saying, don't worry about them, they're wrong, and protect each other, okay? And in fact, a lot of emphasis is on respect. This is not the mafia version of respect, but you find this theme strongly represented in the novel. Reputation, and it's not just respect, it's something socially connotated, is respectability, which means people think you are respectable rather than people respect you, right? There is less power coming with respectability. Reputation, honor, right? Meaning honor in the traditional sense as something that you lose. Once it is stained, you're not honorable anymore, and there is nothing you can do to eliminate that stain. You can compensate for it, but once you lose or your honor is tarnished, then this wound stays with you forever, right? And that's how you go through life with those characters. So that's the name of the protagonist, Lucia Santa. are the two first names. And Angeluzzi is the name of the first husband, Corbo is the name of the second. First husband dies in a railroad yard accident. The second one goes insane, is hospitalized in a mental institution, and eventually dies there during the 1930s, right? She is the fortunate pilgrim. Although the fortunate pilgrim of the title is a theme, right? It's the idea that the migrant is a pilgrim, meaning somebody who attaches a lot of value to the destination, right? The pilgrim goes to a holy place. America, the US, is this place that should have magical qualities. And fortunate alludes to the theme of fortune and misfortune. Again, which brings you back to the theme of control. How much control do you have in your life over the circumstances, right? Losing a husband to an accident, losing a relative to depression, to mental illness, to other physical kinds of illness and disease, right? So she's the leader of the family, but I have to add de facto, because she's not official the leader. She cannot be the leader because she's a woman and a wife. However, she's the primary caregiver for all the kids, with the husband having a bit of an attachment to a couple of the kids, especially the youngest, but not really acting as a father, as a mentor. The first husband is now dead. The second one is mostly absent, spending time away from home for his job, going to work at some point in a farm for a few weeks, and then he's sick, right? So he's not there because he has this mental illness, right? We know that even the previous husband was not there emotionally for the members of the family. But what's interesting is that as a traditional woman, aware of the repercussions of taking official leadership of the family, she cannot be seen by the community as a strong woman. She has to play the part of the submissive wife. She's in control within the family, but she has to allow her husband to take the lead in front of their kids, in front of their community, right? So, but she's playing this game, right? So she's still leading from the bottom, if you wish. Pardon my this kind of rough, approximate language, right? So, because even she, as strong as she is, she's subject to the pressures and the inhibitions forced upon her by the community. In any case, she's the one setting the rules, right? Everyone in the family has to go by her rules. In this respect, she's like Don Vito Corleone. And she is strongly, firmly in charge of the goals. What are the goals for the family? Get out of New York, get a house in Long Island, comfortable one, without too many people around, because, as we said, members of the outside world are always intruding directly or indirectly. She's saving money secretly. She's hiding from the family the fact that she received money when her husband died. The railroad company gave her money to her, I think $3,000, and then $1,000 per kid that she had from this man to be put in a trust. But she's hiding this because she doesn't want anyone, neither her kids nor her second husband, to take this treasure away from her. She's secretly putting away $5 per week, and she's been doing that at the beginning of the novel for several years, so she already has $1,500. But not in the bank, it's postal savings, okay? Might be an Italian thing. Up until the end of the 20th century, the biggest bank in Italy was the post office, the postal system, because all the older people I knew kept their money not in the bank, but at the post office. Because even in a small village like my wife's village of 300 people, there was no bank, but there was a post office. So you can deposit money, get money out of the post office, and the post office would do that in the past. Now, who has money in the post office now? I don't think anyone, or not any. Like Don Vito, she's obstinate, she has this quiet strength, force, but she's very pragmatic, almost cynical, right? She's not positive about life in general. In her life, in the life of the characters, it's all about primary needs, right? To be fed, to be clothed, to have a roof, to be healthy, right? Those are the primary needs for her. So she has long-term goals, but as long as the primary needs are satisfied, she feels happy, reassured. She thinks that her kids should feel the same way. And her kids instead feel lonely. Some of them feel depressed, right? Because the modern world and the culture of our world from the 20th century on is about suffering from the unfulfilled secondary or tertiary needs, right? I used effectual, which is a Machiavellian term. Machiavelli talked about effectual reality, meaning you need to see reality for what it is. You cannot juxtapose your dreams or your ideals. Let's say you're a Christian and you have this idealized view that reality is governed by providence, by God, that the Holy Spirit is everywhere. Machiavelli would say, yeah, you can be a believer, but reality, you should treat reality as it is, without any additions that are just in your mind, in your head. And she has this very direct view of reality that makes her a bit sad. And she has her own sense of justice. So she is all about honor, respectability, reputation, yet she wants her kids to go and steal ice in the summer, coal in the winter. Because she thinks that they deserve that. Because they are not treated fairly by society. And also she believes that it's fair because she's doing it for her family's survival. So she doesn't feel that she is immoral by condoning this kind of cheating, small acts of cheating. She's perfectly fine for that, in that particular context. It becomes uncomfortable when her oldest son, Larry Lorenzo, essentially becomes an external member of the mafia, works for a pseudo-union. You know, one of the ways the racket worked up until the 1970s, at least in New York, was that you went to a place and you said, of course, everyone working here has to be a member of this union and pay their dues. Either you, the owner of the place, the manager, pay the dues, or they pay, but I need to collect, there are 20 people here, I need to collect at least 15 memberships, right? And this was essentially racket. These unions did nothing for their members, or very little, and the money went to replenish the coffers of the mafia families, right? So even when just to make a modern reference, when the Twin Towers were built, for example, the system was still in place there, right? So there were union fees collected that went to the mafia, not to mention what had to be paid on the cement, on the concrete used for the Twin Towers. Now, a novel works by having some kind of contrast, right? Otherwise there is no movement. And the easiest way to create movement in the narrative is contrast. Here, initially the contrast is between Lucia and her kids. So the issue is obedience and compliance. Are the kids obeying her? And meaning obeying her direct orders? Are they complying with the set of guidelines she sets for them? Meaning voluntarily embracing certain behaviors. And she uses influence, she uses persuasion with them, right? Influence rather than love, or together with love. Persuasion, insisting on certain things. then also a lot of deterrence, constantly threatening, as you will see in those 2 chapters I posted, threatening their kids to use violence on them, to use a belt, the strop, the belt used by barbers to sharpen their razors, or a paddle on them. And what's interesting is that in this family, there is a lot of hatred and fear within the family, right? So you know it's a dysfunctional family. It's not exactly an affectionate group of people, but more like a small society, right? That's an interesting element of the novel. The other issue that creates a contrast is control over society, right? And clearly Lucia Santa, who barely speaks English, who stays home to look after her kids and her husband, has limited control. First, outside force, the biggest force, is the economy as a big machine, right? A big organization. The first image, right? Often a novel, a well-made novel, will open with some kind of allegorical image. In this case is Larry on his horse, like a modern cowboy, running around these trains that go through the city from Hudson Yards to then go everywhere in the United States. And there is this huge machine, the locomotive engine with all the train cars attached to it. But it's clearly an allegory of the economy, right? This huge force that cannot be controlled. You can run around it, you can be connected to it, or you can work as a parasite, attach yourself to it. So clearly low-level workers are external, marginal to the machinery. They have no control. And you can also be a parasite to this system. For example, by stealing a little bit, by bootlegging, by other forms of cheating. If they're small enough, you can get by, right? You're not really a criminal in this system. Now, the family, rather than being able to protect itself, is exposed to potential attacks from the outside. They're always in fear that they'll be excluded because if they do something, or one of them does something, a big sin, a big moral violation, then without their reputation, they'll be left out in the cold, right? They'll be abandoned by society. Lucia experienced that with her widowhood. When she first lost her husband, she was a young woman in her 20s with kids, but with no husband. And she was ostracized because traditionally, this is not limited to this novel, but traditionally in Italian society, in other societies as well, young widows were considered the source of temptations. They don't have a husband to tell them what to do, what not to do, and they're young, so they have this strong sexual urges, and they'll go poaching husbands from other families. So she's kept at a distance by the other families until she marries again, and now, even though her husband is not in control, officially everything is fine, right? And I talked about this lack of cohesion, about the fact that they don't come together to help each other, protect each other from the attacks of the family. If one is attacked by society, the others rush to criticize this member of the family. Of course, a big issue is the Americanization of the kids, right? The kids are more exposed to this danger. America as a world of opportunities, represented, for example, by the second kid of Lucia, called Octavia, who goes very ambitious, goes from making dresses to selling sewing machine and teaching how to use a sewing machine. And therefore, she has this strong desire to realize her life outside of the family, right? With living in the US comes this idea of freedom as a central theme in American society, right? Freedom from the traditional constraints, be whatever you can be, right? That is the famous commercial for the US military, but encapsulates the idea of the American individualism, right? Don't get anyone box you into a limited set of options, right? But then, as you may have experienced, or you may have seen friends of yours experience, you're limited in your choices by the fact that you live with parents who sacrifice themselves as migrants to establish a family and pay for your education, for your opportunities. And these parents want to realize their goals vicariously through you, right? And again, if you are a first-generation college student, you may experience that, right? Or in other ways, you don't necessarily have to be in a family of migrants, right? So you feel this pressure. And the American dream in Puzo's book is at the same time a project, something you work on, but also an illusion. Look at this passage about Ottavia. So Ottavia has to sell these sewing machines. And one of the ways you sell anything, even if you go to Best Buy now, or maybe Ludovica would be able to tell us about selling techniques, you have to establish a relationship with the customer, right? So you have to become friendly with them in some way. So Ottavia knows about this. She knows that she has to smile, right, become friends, but she also feels compromised if she does that. And she feels particularly compromised morally, with her own moral compass, if she has then to close the deal and be a bit of a bully in closing the deal. And she feels that this is too much for her, right? So there is this keep in mind, the novel is 1965, so it's appropriate in this case to make a reference to the concept developed in the 1950s and 60s by Marxist intellectuals of the immaterial labor, right? So what is your labor if you're in a cafe selling coffee? Just making the coffee, that would be the material labor, right? The immaterial labor is to smile at the customer, to talk to them, to develop a connection, etc. Right? And it's a very nice passage. The man could write, and then sometimes he wrote episodes that are a bit cringy, but it's a nice passage in reference to the conclusion that you find here, where she's fired and they tell her, you're a nice girl, right? Meaning you're not a saleswoman because you're so nice. And she feels that it's easier for the man who works there, for the manager, to say that about her, that there is a fundamental lack of symmetry between them. And in this asymmetry, she gets humiliated, right, and mistreated by the system, right? Even though they're in the US, the old country is still weighing on every character, right? The old ways you have to live in a certain way, even though you move to the United States. Those are the known paths, right? So yes, there is the American dream, the American way of life, but you cannot deviate from some paths. For example, the forced passive acceptance of traditional institutions such as marriage. And the characters, Lucia, her daughter Ottavia, they know that marriage is a failing institution, the kind of traditional marriage where the husband is the head of the family, the pater familias. In Roman terms, the owner of the family, right? In Roman law, the father could sell their kids as slaves. But you still have to submit to the accepted models even when you have power. Lucia, as I said, has the power, is the leader of the family, but she has to pretend that she's the submissive wife. You see it here in this passage, right? When her husband, Frank, is taken to a mental hospital, and then they need to visit him and assess the situation, perhaps talk to the doctors and take the husband back home, right? And Lucia doesn't want that. Ottavia doesn't want that. But they're both women, and they feel they have to consider this choice, even though they feel it's wrong. And then they cave to the insistence of Larry, Lorenzo, who's the oldest male son, the oldest son of Antonio, and therefore the man of the house is in the hospital. Larry is the male of the family. And Larry says, oh, this man just made one mistake, right? Treated you badly once. In fact, he was mistreating her constantly, abusing her verbally and physically. But Larry, as the man of the house, says, let's get him out. But the doctors will tell Lucia, no, he's too seriously ill to be able to go home, right? So women always have more restrictions, especially younger women. But at the same time, yes, there are expectations linked to everyone's role in the family, but motherhood comes with a form of power, right? And this is very much related to Italian culture. Not to say that mothers are not important in other cultures, but there are some cultures where motherhood confers a special power, right? So that's one context in which the relationship between the female member of the family and the male member, the sons, has a different kind of power dynamics, at least initially, until the kids become adults, right? The other big theme in here, and I'm getting to the conclusion of this presentation, is control over nature, right? Because there are natural forces that the fortunate pilgrim cannot control, hence fortunate, which is ironic because Lucia is not really that fortunate. She has a lot of bad things happening to her and her family. A lot of episodes center around sickness, physical sickness, mental sickness, and death. Right? There is always this looming threat. And it's 1928, so granted, there are more opportunities for death. And nature means that there is a destiny inscribed new biologically, right? Because you have a body and you have a personality that you cannot really change, and that will shape your path in life. For example, Ottavia would like to build a different life for herself, but she has to repress and avoid the dangers involved in her blossoming sexuality, right? She's becoming a woman and an attractive woman, so she knows that she will be the target of certain kinds of attention, right? So she cannot escape the fact that she has this strong sexual presence. Lorenzo, the oldest son, is also stronger than kids his age and has a bit of social charisma, and that will mark his destiny, including this partial success. Works for the mafia, for this fake union, makes a lot of money, has a lot of women, but is not happy within his own family, his primary family, and his married family. And Frank, it's not his fault that he will become mentally ill. It's just his nature, right? And then, once his mental illness takes over, his social dignity will be stripped from him because he'll end up in a hospital, right? So his death, in a very poetic page towards the end of the novel, is represented as his successful escape from the hospital. So finally, he breaks free from this terrible place in Brentwood, the Pilgrim Hospital. And in general, the characters are always looking for protection against evil, against misfortunes, protection that they think might come from others. They're always saviors, people, they're rich people, they're offering jobs, and they're never the saviors they expected. Money itself is, money savings is also a way to save oneself, building a protective wall against misfortunes. And then dignity and integrity are seen as other walls, other defenses, right? If I keep my dignity, meaning people see me as a good member of the community, complying with all the codes, and if I keep my integrity, that is to say, I can look at myself in the mirror, so to speak, and be happy with who I am, then I'm protected from life, from the evils, right? Because there is this primitive ancestral belief that evil will be punished in one way or the other. And if you're not evil, you'll be protected, right? And yeah, a lot of characters try to be true to themselves, but struggling to do it without hurting others, such as Lucia. And I talked about this idea of respectability. That's the final slide, and we have 15 minutes. I thought we might have more, but we can continue on Thursday. I invite you to go to week 8, and at the end of the section on the Fortunate Pilgrim, you will find this link to the excerpts. There's 2 chapters, not too many pages, and have a look. Start having a look at the passages and the characters and see what you recognize. You can match what you read with my presentation, but my goal, maybe too ambitious, you tell me, would be what can you see in there that connects Lucia, the mother, to Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather. See if you find any connections in the language, in the actions, etc. As usual, you can do it individually, you can do it as a group with 1 or 2 other people. And if you have your computer, you can place your notes. It doesn't matter if it is just a few comments, right? Don't feel obliged to write full pages. But if you have a computer, put your notes, your comments in your Google Docs file, and have one in the group act as the scribe. Just include the names of everyone in the group.